50 years ago, a group of self-described revolutionaries did something that shocked the world. In just 2 years, they declared war on America, assassinated a beloved school superintendent, robbed several banks, bombed several police cars, murdered an innocent bystander, kidnapped heiress Patty Hearst, and convinced her to join their cause before most of the group burned to death in a fiery shootout in Los Angeles, right on live television. This webcast is about everything that made that story possible, and almost none of it is what I expected to find when I started looking. I came to this project with a set of beliefs about the Symbionese Liberation Army and the era that produced them. I had to dismantle most of those beliefs before I could tell this story honestly. This is the story of who the SLA really were, what they actually believed, and what it tells us about a nation that is still grappling with the same failures that produced them. This is House on Fire, Patty Hearst, the SLA, and the Seduction of Revolution.
I came to this series with a set of assumptions. I'd spent years fascinated by radical movements, the counterculture, the fever dream of the late 1960s and early 1970s. I thought I understood the arc. Vietnam radicalized a generation. That generation radicalized the prisons. The prisons produced the revolutionary leadership the movement had been looking for. And somewhere in that chain of cause and effect, the Symbionese Liberation Army was born. I was right about some of that. I was wrong about more of it than I expected. I assumed the young people who walked into Vacaville, the students, activists, and volunteers who sat across from incarcerated men and began with lessons in literacy and evolved into heated debates about history, politics, and revolution, that these visits were a mutual radicalization, that the college kids went in to teach literacy and came out transformed by the realities of the people they met, that the inmates read a few books, had a few meaningful conversations, and woke up about the cycle of violence and crime that they had been trapped within, that it was all innocent and organic and born of genuine idealism. What I found was something more intentional and more disturbing. The young people who later formed the Symbionese Liberation Army did not go into prisons as doe-eyed innocents. They arrived already radicalized, already convinced that Black inmates represented the revolutionary vanguard that the American left had been waiting for. They were not there to teach literacy. They were, in the most specific sense, recruiting, looking for the right man to lead the movement they had already decided was coming. That discovery changed how I understood everything that followed in the story of the SLA. Because if they went looking deliberately, purposefully, with a theory already well fomented, then the question is not how they became radicalized. The question is, how did they end up with Donald DeFreeze? Of all the men in California's prison system, of all the genuine intellectuals and organizers and committed revolutionaries that decades of mass incarceration had produced, they ended up with a petty criminal, a gun runner, a documented police informant with deep-rooted feelings of inadequacy, a troubled man who had been in prison a relatively short time and had no established political credibility among the inmates around him. Why him? That question is what this episode is about. If the civil rights movement was the argument that America could be persuaded to live up to its own promises, the prison system was the place where that argument went to die.
I do not mean metaphorically. In the institutions where the state stored the people it had decided were expendable, and where, Against every intention of the people running those institutions, something unexpected was happening.
But before we get to what was happening inside those prisons, we need to understand what the prisons themselves actually were. Because the story this country tells about incarceration, that it is a system of justice, of consequence, of rehabilitation, is one of the most consequential lies in American public life. And by the late 1960s, a growing number of people inside those walls had stopped believing it. The prison industrial complex, the phrase itself is not yet in common use, but the reality it describes was fully operational, is the direct descendant of convict leasing. Same economic logic, same racial targeting, same function, to extract labor and profit from Black bodies under the legal cover of criminal justice. By the mid-20th century, the machinery had been modernized. The chain gangs were less visible. The legal procedures were more elaborate. The racial disparities in arrest, prosecution, conviction, and sentencing were no less stark, but they could be attributed to factors other than explicit racial intent, which gave the system a layer of plausible deniability not previously needed.
California's prison system in the late 1960s was, by any honest measure, a system of racial warehousing. Black men were incarcerated at rates wildly disproportionate to their share of the population. The indeterminate sentencing laws, which allowed parole boards to extend sentences indefinitely based on subjective assessments of an inmate's attitude and rehabilitation, gave prison administrators extraordinary power over the lives of the people in their custody.
Power that was exercised consistently and documentably along racial lines.
A Black man who displayed defiance, who refused to perform the particular kind of submission that the system demanded, could be held for years beyond any fixed sentence.
Who decided whether he was sufficiently rehabilitated? The same institution that was incarcerating him. The conditions inside were brutal in ways that went beyond the ordinary brutality of incarceration. Guards funneled drugs to inmate dealers and took a cut of the profits. Inmates who refused to participate in those arrangements were put in isolation. There were documented cases of guards offering compensation to prisoners willing to kill other prisoners deemed troublesome. And at the California Medical Facility at Vacaville, something was happening that went beyond even these brutalities. Documented psychological experiments, behavior modification programs, CIA funding under programs with names like MKUltra and MK Search, using prisoners as subjects in ways that would have been classified as torture if done by any other name. We will return to Vacaville in detail in this episode, but for now, understand that the institution was doing things to the people in its custody that its administrators would not have wanted on the front page of a newspaper. George Lester Jackson was born in Chicago in 1941. His family moved to Los Angeles when he was a child. By his late teens, he had accumulated the kind of minor criminal record that many young people in poor urban neighborhoods accrued. A record that reflected not exceptional criminality, but the predictable collision of poverty, limited opportunity, and a criminal justice system calibrated to find criminality wherever it looked for it in Black communities. In 1961, at 20 years old, he was convicted of stealing $70 from a gas station. Under California's indeterminate sentencing laws, he received a sentence of 1 year to life. That phrase, 1 year to life, meant that the length of his imprisonment was not determined by the crime he had committed. It was determined by the parole board's assessment of him, year after year, for the rest of his life if they chose. And the parole board chose again and again, not because he committed new crimes, because he refused to perform the kind of submission the system required. because he was reading, because he was thinking, because he was refusing to accept the terms of his own degradation. He spent the next decade at San Quentin and Soledad, and he used that decade to transform himself into one of the most formidable political thinkers the American left had produced since the Second World War. He read Marx and Lenin and Mao. He read Frantz Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth, the Martiniquais psychiatrist's analysis of colonialism and its psychological effects on the colonized, which would become the most important book in the ideological library of every radical organization we are discussing in this series. Jackson read everything. He thought hard about what he read, and then he wrote. His letters, smuggled out of prison and published in 1970 as Soledad Brother, did not read like the reflections of a convicted gas station robber. They were precise, disciplined, frequently brilliant, and absolutely incandescent with rage. Jackson argued that American prisons were not correctional institutions. They were instruments of racial and economic control, that Black men were being warehoused as a matter of deliberate policy, not as the regrettable outcome of a neutral system, that the prison system was the most naked and honest expression of what American racial capitalism actually was beneath its democratic rhetoric, that prisoners were not criminals who had failed society. They were a colonized class, the domestic equivalent of the populations that European empires had subjugated abroad, and that their radicalization would be the spark of the revolution the left had been waiting for. This argument was not new. Versions of it had been made by Black radicals for decades. What was new was the clarity and force with which Jackson made it, and the moment in which it arrived. Soledad Brother was published in 1970 at the exact moment when the white radical left was most desperately searching for the constituency that would validate its theory of revolution. They had tried to organize the working class. The working class had not been interested. They had tried to organize students. Students graduated and got jobs. They had tried, through the Weather Underground and its predecessors, to shock the country into consciousness through symbolic violence. The country had absorbed the violence and moved on. And here, in the most marginalized, most brutalized, most deliberately excluded population in America, in the prisons that the country preferred not to look at, was a voice arguing that the revolution was already happening, that the people in those cells were not criminals, they were soldiers, and they were ready. For the white radicals of the Bay Area, Soledad Brother was not just a book, it was a calling. By 1971, scores of Bay Area radicals were volunteering at California prisons, at Vacaville, at San Quentin, at Soledad. They went ostensibly for educational purposes, literacy programs, discussion groups, classes in Black history. The California Department of Corrections permitted these visits because they appeared benign, because they provided the appearance of rehabilitation, and because, as we will discover, at least one person in a position of authority had very defined reasons for wanting these meetings to take place. But the exchange that was actually happening in those visiting rooms was not primarily educational. It was ideological. Students who arrived to teach reading encountered men who had spent years developing a sophisticated analysis of the system that imprisoned them. Men who had read everything George Jackson had read and more. Men who spoke the language of revolution not as an abstraction, but as a description of their daily reality. And some students were changed by it. Not all of them, not even most of them, but enough. Because prison has a way of clarifying power in ways that no lecture can replicate. You see the bars, you see the guards. And if you have already been radicalized by Vietnam and Chicago and Kent State, the prison stops looking like a correctional facility and starts looking like a political statement. An answer to the question, what does this country actually think about the people it claims to serve? On August 21st, 1971, someone smuggled a gun to George Jackson in San Quentin. He freed several of his allies from solitary confinement, and then his group took 6 guards and 2 white inmates as hostages. 5 of these men were later found dead in Jackson's cell with their throats slit. Scores of heavily armed law enforcement officials converged on the prison. "It's me they want," Jackson told a comrade, and then he walked into the prison courtyard where he was killed instantly by a marksman's bullet. Jackson's death hit like a detonation. If the state would kill George Jackson, the revolution could not wait. 2,000 people attended his funeral. His death did not end the movement his writing had helped create. It accelerated it. It confirmed what the most radical voices had been arguing, that the state would kill the people who told the truth about it, that there was no reforming a system this honest about its own violence. And then less than a month later, roughly 1,200 inmates at Attica Correctional Facility in upstate New York seized control of the prison, taking dozens of staff hostage in an uprising that had been building for months over conditions the men inside had been documenting and protesting through legitimate channels with no response. The grievances were well notated: severe overcrowding, inadequate medical care, censorship of mail and reading material, racist treatment by guards, and a prison population that was disproportionately Black and Puerto Rican, while the guard force was almost entirely white. The inmates organized with remarkable discipline once they had control of the yard, forming a representative council, drafting a list of demands, and inviting outside observers, including journalists and a state legislator, to witness the negotiations and ensure the world would see what was actually happening inside Attica's walls. The standoff lasted 4 days. Governor Nelson Rockefeller, despite the inmates' specific request that he come to the facility in person to negotiate, refused to appear. On the morning of September 13th, he ordered state troopers to retake the prison by force. What followed was not a rescue operation in any meaningful sense. Troopers fired indiscriminately into the yard for several minutes, killing 29 inmates and 10 of the hostages the inmates had been holding. Hostages who, in the chaos and smoke, were shot by the same state forces sent in to save them. Initial official reports claimed the hostages had been killed by inmates with knives. Subsequent autopsies proved this was false. Every hostage who died had been killed by gunfire, and the state's weapons were the only firearms inside the prison that day. For the radical movement that would eventually produce organizations like the SLA, Attica became something close to a foundational text, proof delivered in the most visceral and undeniable terms that the state was willing to kill its own citizens, guards included, rather than negotiate seriously with prisoners who had organized themselves peacefully and articulated legitimate grievances. George Jackson had already become a martyr to this movement weeks earlier. Shot dead at San Quentin under circumstances prisoners' rights advocates found deeply suspicious. Attica arrived almost immediately afterward and confirmed, for people already primed to believe it, that the same machinery that had killed Jackson was prepared to kill dozens more without hesitation. The lesson radical organizers drew from Attica wasn't subtle, and it wasn't entirely wrong. The system would rather kill than reform. The California Medical Facility at Vacaville, located in Solano County, between San Francisco and Sacramento, is the state prison system's dedicated institution for inmates requiring medical or psychiatric care, a designation that covers everything from chronic physical illness and serious mental health conditions. Men could be transferred there from other facilities for documented medical needs, But the institution's psychiatric mandate also gave administrators considerable discretion in determining who qualified, which meant Vacaville's population included not just the genuinely ill, but inmates whose primary offense in the eyes of the system was defiance, men who had been labeled difficult, dangerous, or simply inconvenient in ways that a psychiatric designation could contain more quietly than a disciplinary transfer. In 1970, Vacaville formally approved the charter for a 2-year-old prisoner organization called the Black Cultural Association. The BCA, as it was known, met twice a week in the prison library. One evening was devoted to classes: Black history, literature, political theory, kind of intellectual engagement that the prison system otherwise routinely denied its inmates. The other was social: guest speakers, poetry readings, music, film. For the inmates, the BCA offered something rare inside those walls, a space in which their humanity was not just acknowledged, but actively affirmed. A space in which their analysis of their own situation was taken seriously, in which the outside world came to them. The outside coordinator of the BCA was a man named Colston Westbrook. Educated, articulate, Black, well-connected in the Bay Area radical community, Westbrook was the public face of the program, the person who recruited outside volunteers, managed relationships with the prison administration, and shaped the ideological direction of the meetings. He was also a man with a complicated and troubling past. Westbrook had worked in Vietnam as a psychological operations contractor under the Phoenix program, the CIA's covert counterinsurgency operation that involved, among other actions, the targeted assassination of suspected Viet Cong operatives. He had subsequently been employed by Pacific Architects and Engineers, a company with documented CIA connections. At the time of his involvement with the BCA, Westbrook was working as a linguistics instructor at UC Berkeley, and he found volunteers for this prison experience among his pupils. Whether Westbrook was actively running an intelligence operation at Vacaville or was simply a man with a complicated history who ended up in an unusual situation remains genuinely debated. What is not debated is that he was handpicked for this role, not by the prison administration acting alone, but through channels that connected directly to the intelligence community and to the office of Governor Ronald Reagan, who had his own reasons for wanting to monitor the Bay Area radical left. The structure Westbrook created brought ideologically primed young white idealists and radicals into regular, sustained, intimate contact with carefully selected prisoners in an environment where the normal social boundaries between the incarcerated and the free had been deliberately dissolved. That structure could have been designed to do exactly what it appeared to do. It could also have been designed to do something else entirely. And possibly, the most unsettling possibility, both things were true simultaneously. The volunteers who came to Vacaville through the BCA came from different backgrounds, with different motivations, at different stages of their own political development. Some were genuinely there for educational purposes, to teach, to listen, to build human connection across a wall that the state had worked hard to make impermeable. Some were drawn by the intellectual energy of the meetings, by the chance to engage with men who had read everything and thought hard about what they had read. And some, a smaller, more ideologically committed number, came because they believed that inside those walls was the revolutionary leadership the movement needed. 4 of those volunteers will become central to this series. Willie Wolfe, a lanky, warm-hearted 20-year-old archaeology student from a wealthy Pennsylvania family who had read Soledad Brother and felt, as he wrote to his mother after his first Vacaville visit, that he could not unknow what he now knew. Joe Ramiro, a Vietnam veteran whose radicalization had been earned in combat, who had come home from war with a fury that had nowhere to go until it found a political home. Russell Little, quiet, methodical, already deeply embedded in the Bay Area radical network, already committed to the idea that armed struggle was not a question of if, but when. And Nancy Ling Perry, who had traveled the furthest ideologically of any of them, from Goldwater Republican to revolutionary, and who brought to everything she did the ferocity of a complete convert. Now let's talk a little bit about white guilt. It's an easy explanation, the reductive one, and it's not entirely wrong. There was, in the dynamic between white Bay Area radicals and Black prisoners, a dimension of guilt, of the discomfort of people who understood that their comfort was purchased by the suffering of others, and who were trying, in ways that were not always clear-sighted, to do something about that. But it was not primarily guilt that drove these young people into those visiting rooms. It was analysis, a coherent, evidence-based analysis of American society that they had arrived at through years of reading and organizing and watching their country respond to legitimate dissent with surveillance, infiltration, and bullets. They believed that the prison system was a mechanism of racial and economic control. They believed that the men inside those prisons had been put there by a system designed to put them there. They had read George Jackson. They had absorbed his argument that prisoners were a colonized class whose radicalization would spark the revolution the left had been waiting for. And so they were not naive volunteers stumbling into something they didn't understand, at least not these four: Nancy Ling Perry, Russell Little, Joe Ramiro, and Willie Wolfe. They arrived at Vacaville already radicalized, already holding a complete theory of history, already convinced of what they would find. They were not there to educate. They were there to recruit. They believed they were looking for the revolutionary leadership that would change America. The BCA was the recruitment tool. Of all the men inside Vacaville who attended those BCA meetings, of all the inmates who had spent years reading and thinking and developing a sophisticated analysis of the system that held them, the man who ended up at the center of this story was not a charismatic intellectual. He was not a gifted organizer or orator. He was not by any account the most politically sophisticated or the most naturally commanding presence in that prison library. He was a quiet man, a reader, yes, but a recent one. A man described by a court psychologist as emotionally confused and conflicted, with deep-rooted feelings of inadequacy. A man whose criminal record reflected not political resistance, but a compulsive, decades-long fascination with guns and small explosives that had landed him in trouble over and over again with no discernible ideological purpose. A man who had, not incidentally, been a police informant, a fact known to the prison administration and through the administration to Colston Westbrook. His name was Donald David DeFreeze, and the question of how this particular man ended up leading a revolutionary army is one of the most baffling questions in this entire story. Donald David DeFreeze was born in Cleveland, Ohio, in November 1943, the eldest of 8 children. His mother, Mary, worked as a nurse in a convalescent home, a woman described by everyone who knew her as gentle, nurturing, devoted. His father was a tool maker whose blind rages included attacks on the boy with a baseball bat and a hammer. We start there, before the guns, before the ideology, before the name Cinque and the 7-headed cobra and the communiques declaring war on the fascist American state. We begin with a child being beaten by his father, his arms broken more than once. Because everything that follows makes more sense when you understand that Donald DeFreeze spent his entire life trying to escape a pain he could never fully name, reaching for significance in ways that kept landing him in exactly the situations he was trying to escape, and that the system he would eventually claim to be fighting had been shaping and containing and processing him since he was a child. He's not a hero in this story, and he is not yet a revolutionary. He's a human being whose life was a product of specific conditions, and understanding those conditions is not the same as excusing what he did with them. By the time Donald was 14, the violence at home had become intolerable enough that his mother arranged for him to leave. After a brief stay with a cousin in Buffalo, he was placed in the household of a fundamentalist Black preacher, the Reverend William L. Foster, and his family. By every account, including DeFreeze's own, this was the best period of his childhood. He studied the Bible like he'd finally found a lifeline. Reverend Foster described him as a get-up-and-go kid, industrious and eager. He collected and sold scrap metal for pocket money. He seemed, for a moment, to be finding his footing. Then the neighborhood found him. He joined a gang called the Crooked Skulls. In August 1960, at 16, he was arrested attempting to break open a parking meter. 9 days later, he tried to steal a car and a pistol. Booted from the Foster household and sent to a boys' reformatory in Elmira, New York, he would later describe this as the beginning of his political consciousness. What it actually was at the time was the beginning of a criminal record that would follow him for the rest of his life. What happened to Donald DeFreeze between 1960 and 1969 is a story that the American criminal justice system generates thousands of times every year and almost never examines. A young man with a difficult history, limited economic options, and a compulsive relationship with a particular kind of transgression. In his case, guns and small explosives, which he collected and tinkered with and got arrested for in a bewildering variety of circumstances across multiple states, moving through a system that processed him repeatedly, punished him inconsistently, and never once addressed the conditions that kept producing the behavior. He married Gloria Thomas in 1963. She was 23, already had 3 children, and according to the reverend who performed the ceremony, she was remembered as very talkative, while DeFreeze was quiet, passive, reserved. They had 3 more children together. He drank. He disappeared for days. He struggled to hold jobs. He was ordered to court for desertion less than a year after the wedding. He abandoned his family briefly for a 2-month trip to Canada, came back to find Gloria pregnant, convinced himself the child wasn't his, separated from her, watched her return and beg forgiveness. I started playing around with guns and fireworks and dogs and cars, he wrote years later, just anything to get away from life and how unhappy I was. The guns were not political. This can't be stressed enough. For years before Donald DeFreeze arrived at any ideology, before he read George Jackson or Mao or Fanon, before he called himself Cinque, he was obsessed with weapons in a way that had nothing to do with revolution and everything to do with whatever it was that guns gave him. Power, perhaps, or the illusion of control over a life that felt profoundly out of control, or simply the focused absorption of a man who needed something to do with his hands. He built bombs from fireworks in his basement in New Jersey. Later, after he and Gloria and the kids moved west, he was found hitchhiking on the San Bernardino Freeway in California with a sawed-off shotgun, a sharpened butter knife, and a homemade tear gas canister. He was later arrested riding a bicycle through a red light in Los Angeles and found to have a pistol and 2 homemade bombs in the basket. He stole guns, hundreds of them eventually, from military surplus stores and gun shops across Southern California, and he sold them on the black market to street gangs and possibly to members of the Black Panther Party. None of this was ideological. All of it was compulsive. A court-ordered psychological evaluation painted a portrait of a man at war with himself, emotionally adrift, burdened by feelings of inadequacy he had never found a way to resolve. He tried to go straight. He enrolled in an aircraft assembly course. Lockheed turned him away when they discovered his record. He wrote a letter to one sentencing judge that is one of the most genuinely heartbreaking documents in this entire story. A man asking, with what reads as real desperation, for one more chance. Sir, I want you to answer my kids' prayers that they have been praying for so many months. Dear Lord, please send our daddy home for Christmas. We don't want toys or trees or anything. We just want our daddy so we can be happy like we used to be. He received probation. He violated it. He received probation again. He violated that too. The system processed him and processed him and processed him, and each time it released him back into conditions designed to produce the same results. And then in 1967, DeFreeze was caught with stolen guns, part of a cache of 200 weapons stolen from a military supply store in Torrance. Facing serious time, he made a deal. He led police to his associate, a man named Ronald Coleman. Ron has them, he told the detectives. Let's hit him. Coleman was arrested. DeFreeze walked. Arresting officer Ronald G. Farwell recognized what he had. DeFreeze was not a political radical. He was not ideologically committed to anything. He was a man who needed to stay out of prison and who had demonstrated a willingness to give up associates to accomplish that. Farwell recruited him as an informant for the LAPD's Criminal Conspiracy Section, a unit created specifically to infiltrate, surveil, and disrupt the Black Panthers and other radical organizations in Los Angeles. Research has also indicated that DeFreeze was simultaneously working for the California state equivalent of the FBI, the Criminal Investigation and Identification Unit, listed in their records as CII case number 2771103. Author David Talbot has gone further, alleging that the weapons used to kill Bunchy Carter and John Huggins of the Black Panther Party at UCLA in January 1969 by US organization, a rival group to the Panthers, were supplied by DeFreeze himself. Now, that claim has not been independently verified, and the series is not in a position to do so. But the moral complexity of this cannot be glossed over. DeFreeze was a man being ground up by the same system he would later claim to be fighting. A man with few options and no political ideology who made the choice that countless people in his position make. He cooperated. He traded information for freedom. Whether the weapons that killed Bunchy Carter and John Huggins passed through his hands or not, what the documented record shows is that the system that had been arresting him since he was 16 now had leverage over him that it would use in ways that went far beyond routine criminal informancy. By November of 69, his probation finally revoked after he robbed a sex worker of a cashier's check and led police on a foot chase while firing at them until he ran out of bullets. DeFreeze was sent to Vacaville for a minimum of 5 years. He arrived as what he was, a petty criminal with a compulsive relationship with weapons, a history of cooperation with law enforcement, a court psychologist's assessment of emotional inadequacy, and no political ideology whatsoever. What the prison would do to him, or more precisely, what certain people inside the prison would do to him, is the subject of our next act. Donald DeFreeze arrived at Vacaville in 1970. To pass the time, he started reading pornography and men's magazines, and then slowly soaking up the intellectual atmosphere of California's prison system. Over the next 3 years, he found something else. He found George Jackson, Reading Soledad Brother, DeFreeze experienced something that many people who encounter the right book at the right moment in their lives will recognize. A sensation of a framework clicking into place around experiences that had previously felt random and shameful. None of it, he discovered, was really his fault. The Black man in America never had a chance. He never had a chance. The poverty, the instability, the arrests, the inability to hold a job or keep a family together, these were not personal failures. They were the predictable outcome of a system designed to produce exactly these outcomes in Black men. He was not a criminal. He was a political prisoner. The system had put him here not because of what he had done, but because of what he was. This is a seductive argument. It is also, in its broad structural outlines, largely correct. The system had shaped Donald DeFreeze in ways that were real and documentable. The deck had been stacked against him from the beginning, going back generations. George Jackson's analysis was not wrong. But there is a difference between understanding that a system has shaped you and building an identity entirely around that understanding, using it not as a framework for political action, but as a complete substitute for personal accountability, a lens through which every failure is the system's fault and every impulse towards significance is validated as revolutionary consciousness. Donald DeFreeze made that leap, and the environment of Vacaville and the people around him made that leap not just possible, but actively encouraged. Vacaville in the early 1970s was not simply a prison. It was, by documented evidence, a site of extraordinary and illegal experimentation on the people in its custody. The CIA's MKUltra and MK Search programs, behavior modification operations that used witting and unwitting human subjects for drug experiments and psychological testing, had funding running through the California Medical Facility at the prison before DeFreeze arrived. Operation Chaos, the CIA's domestic surveillance program, had entered into at least 44 operations with state and local law enforcement, far beyond what was acknowledged later in the 1975 Rockefeller Report. The treatment DeFreeze received at Vacaville is documented, if incompletely. He was injected with Prolixin, an antipsychotic medication that, administered against someone's will, constitutes chemical coercion. He volunteered for medical research in July 1970, when volunteering meant signing paperwork to avoid punishment. A fellow inmate named Clifford Jefferson, incarcerated with DeFreeze at the same time, stated in an affidavit prepared later for Patty Hearst's initial lawyer that both he and DeFreeze had been subjected to drug experiments, mescaline, quaaludes, artane, that left them terrified and disoriented, followed by other drugs to calm them down, followed by stress tests in solitary confinement designed to break down their resistance until they would, in Jefferson's words, do anything that was asked of them. We do not know with certainty what was done to Donald DeFreeze at Vacaville. We know some of it. We know enough to ask, seriously and without conspiracy theorizing, a question that most accounts of this story never bother to ask. How responsible was the man for what he subsequently did? And if the answer to that question is complicated, if the line between his choices and what was done to him is genuinely difficult to draw, what does that mean for our understanding of everything that followed? What is not in dispute is what Vacaville produced in DeFreeze, whatever its methods. A man who had convinced himself, by the time he encountered the Black Cultural Association, that he was the revolutionary George Jackson had been calling for. That his life, all of it, the beatings and the arrests and the reformatories and the failed marriage and the guns in the basement and the snitch deals with the LAPD, had been building toward this moment. That he was not a petty criminal who had been processed by the system. He was a soldier who had been forged by it. Donald was quiet initially in the meetings, studious. Russ Little, who met him at the BCA, remembered him clearly. He didn't use contemporary Marxist language, but he studied all that shit, man. He understood it intellectually, and he could run it down that way if he wanted to. But he wasn't about to do that. He didn't think that was going to get him anywhere. This is not a description of a charismatic revolutionary leader. It is a description of a quiet man who had absorbed a body of political thought and was holding it, carefully, waiting. What he had, what the white radicals who visited the BCA needed him to have, was authenticity. He was Black. He was incarcerated. He had been processed by the system that their ideology told them was the primary instrument of racial oppression. He had suffered the suffering that their theory of revolution required its leadership class to have suffered. He was, in their framework, the genuine article. That this particular man had also been a police informant, that his relationship to revolutionary ideology was intellectual rather than visceral, that he had been described by a court psychologist as emotionally confused, with deep-rooted feelings of inadequacy, that he was being cultivated by a CIA-connected operative for purposes that had nothing to do with revolution. None of this was visible to the young white radicals who sat across from him in the prison library and saw what they needed to see. Of all the inmates at Vacaville, of all the genuine intellectuals, the committed organizers, the men who had spent years developing sophisticated political analyses and building real credibility among the prison population, Colston Westbrook chose to particularly cultivate Donald DeFreeze. The reasons, once you know DeFreeze's history, are not that mysterious. DeFreeze was quiet and compliant. He had no genuine political base among the other inmates. He had no regular outside visitors, which meant he was isolated and dependent. And most importantly, he had been a police informant for the LAPD, a fact known to the prison administrators and to Westbrook. This meant he could be leveraged. If he resisted whatever role was being prepared for him, the administration could expose him as a snitch, a status that in the prison environment could be a death sentence. Westbrook gave DeFreeze access to the conjugal trailers at Vacaville, a privilege otherwise reserved for married inmates. He facilitated introductions between DeFreeze and the white radicals coming in through the BCA. He encouraged DeFreeze's growing sense of revolutionary destiny. And then in June 1972, DeFreeze attempted to formalize his status by running for chairman of the BCA. And he was ruled ineligible for not having attended the minimum required number of meetings. He was furious, not with the measured, principled anger of a political organizer who believes a process has been corrupted, with the entitled rage of a man who expected preferential treatment and was genuinely shocked not to receive it. He approached the prison administration to demand the ruling be overridden. He threatened legal action against the prison organization and the California state court system, an action so procedurally absurd that even if he had filed, the case would have been immediately remanded back to the Department of Corrections. He drafted a legal writ protesting his removal from the ballot, though he never filed it. The presiding BCA chairman, inmate Robert Jackson, who had his own well-founded suspicions that DeFreeze was an informant and had been quietly spreading that information among people he trusted, held firm. Another inmate, Cecil Moody, won the chairmanship. And then Westbrook moved quickly to manage the damage. Unisight was the result. After DeFreeze's humiliation in the BCA election, Westbrook interceded with the Vacaville administration to create a new organization specifically for DeFreeze. The name Unisight stood for nothing in particular, and the pamphlet introducing it to the prison population reflected that vacancy. opening with a description of its purpose as a community prison information center. Language so vague and corporate it seemed designed to communicate as little as possible. Elsewhere, the pamphlet stated that Unisite was responsible for the BCA family reorganization and education classes, which purpose it is to re-assimilate and re-educate the Black male to the needs and responsibility of the Black family, and to give the Black female an understanding of her past and the relationship between the Black male and herself. Wait, what? Unisite purported to help Black inmates and their families interact harmoniously, and yet Donald DeFreeze had a wife and 6 children, only 2 of whom he acknowledged paternity of, whose current address he did not know. He was using the conjugal trailers to have sexual relationships with Nancy Ling Perry and other white women who visited him. The man being positioned as the authority on Black family relationships had abandoned his own family repeatedly, had been taken to court for desertion, had left his children in circumstances so desperate that he had begged a judge for a Christmas release, and was now, in the eyes of this new organization, the qualified guide for other Black men navigating family and community, the philosophical framework underneath Unisite's stated purpose was not original, by the way, to Westbrook or to DeFreeze. It was lifted directly from the 7 Kwanzaa principles developed by Ron Karenga. The same Ron Karenga whose US organization killed Bunchy Carter and John Huggins at UCLA in 1969, and whose organization, as we discussed earlier, may have received the weapons used in those killings from DeFreeze himself. Now, this could mean nothing beyond the tangled overlaps of a very small world. Karenga's framework was simply the most developed Black organizational philosophy available in California radical circles at the time, and Westbrook, as organizer, may have reached for it because it was there and useful without any deeper significance. The convergence, DeFreeze, Karenga, the Dead Panthers, Unisite, may reflect not a coordinated strategy, but something murkier. DeFreeze as a useful tool for multiple overlapping interests. Westbrook pursuing his own agenda. The Karenga framework arriving for reasons that had more to do with Westbrook's own connections than any deliberate plan. We just don't have a clean answer. What we have is the pattern. Unisite had 10 inmate participants and 5 outside volunteers. 2 of those 5 outsiders were Westbrook's own wife and sister. Willie Wolfe and Russ Little were involved, by the way, from the start, along with Little's girlfriend, Robin Steiner. In comparison to the 100 people the BCA drew at its peak, Unisite was barely an organization at all. It was a personal favor, a consolation prize, a platform engineered for one man by the person who had the most to gain from keeping that man cooperative, connected, and convinced of his own importance. It was also possibly something more deliberate than that, because what Unisite accomplished beyond stroking DeFreeze's ego was to tighten the bonds between him and the white radicals that Westbrook had been assembling. Willie Wolfe, Russ Little, Joe Ramiro, Nancy Ling Perry, the people who would become the SLA. Unisite formalized those connections inside the prison walls. It gave them a structure, a meeting place, a reason to gather regularly around one man. Whatever else it was a mechanism for assembling the people who would eventually follow Donald DeFreeze underground. Whether that assembly was intentional, whether someone with interests in discrediting the Bay Area radical left was engineering the construction of a group almost perfectly designed to self-destruct and take the broader movement down with it, is a question this series will return to. We do not have a clean answer. We may never have one. In December 1972, rumors began circulating among BCA members that Colston Westbrook was connected to the CIA. The source may have been Clifford Jefferson, who had spoken of the drug experiments. It may have been another inmate who had researched Westbrook's employment history and traced his connections to Pacific Architects and Engineers and the Phoenix program. Whatever the source, when the rumors hardened into official complaints and reached the prison administration, something remarkable happened. Vacaville moved with extraordinary and unprecedented speed to force Westbrook's resignation. The speed was the tell. In an institution where a prisoner's complaint about a guard's behavior produced essentially nothing, where the administration's default response to inmate grievance was isolation and punishment, the BCA's objections to Westbrook produced immediate capitulation. The public explanation that Westbrook had been insisting on a more structured educational agenda was so inadequate that no one who knew anything about the situation took it seriously. Westbrook was replaced by a young Oakland man named James Mayfield. In the months that followed, Westbrook committed his energies to publicly denying his intelligence background and deflecting blame in multiple directions. The organization he had built, the network of relationships between one carefully cultivated inmate and a group of already radicalized white Bay Area volunteers, remained intact. Donald DeFreeze was still at Vacaville. He was reading, he was meeting with Wolfe and Little and Perry and the others. And by late 1972, he had renamed himself Cinque Mitume, after the leader of the Amistad Revolt, the man who had led a successful uprising of enslaved Africans against their captors. He had chosen deliberately the name of a man who had fought his way free. Cinque was, in his own mind, already free. Yet for now, he was still in his cell. It is easy to talk about movements in the plural. It's easy to speak of generations, of ideological climates, of the pressures that turn ordinary people toward extraordinary and sometimes terrible things. We can say that the country was angry, that the Vietnam War fractured trust, that prisons became political classrooms, that a generation of white radicals found in the prison reform movement a cause that validated everything their theory of history required. All of that is true. And none of it fully explains what we've been looking at in this episode. Because movements do not act, people do. History does not radicalize itself. It radicalizes individuals. And the individual at the center of this story, the man sitting in a cell at Vacaville, reading George Jackson, calling himself Cinque, watching the white radicals arrive twice a week, and seeing in their eyes the reflection of the revolutionary leader he had decided to become, was not what they thought he was. Donald DeFreeze was a petty criminal with a compulsive relationship with guns, a documented police informant who had traded associates for freedom more than once, a man whose fellow inmates suspected was a snitch, whose one significant achievement at Vacaville was a personal vanity project engineered by a CIA-connected operative with very specific interests in the Bay Area radical left. How did anyone look at this man and see a revolutionary leader? There are two possible answers. The first is that the white radicals who chose him were so blinded by their own ideology, so desperate to find the great black hope their theory of history required, that they genuinely could not see who was sitting in front of them. That Willie Wolfe, who wrote home to his mother about the horrors of Vacaville and then kept driving back up there every week, or Russell Little, who had asked the California Department of Corrections to parole a man serving a minimum 5-year sentence, were simply true believers in a theory that needed a symbol more than a leader. The second answer is darker, that someone who understood exactly who DeFreeze was, who knew about the LAPD informant history, the court psychologist assessment, the leverage the California Department of Corrections held over him, saw in him not a revolutionary leader, but a perfect instrument, a man who could be aimed at the radical left like a weapon, who would discredit every legitimate grievance they carried, who would alienate every potential ally, who would commit acts so indefensible that the movement would spend years trying to recover from the association, who would hand the state exactly the enemy it needed at exactly the moment it needed one. We don't know which answer is true. In all these years, it has never been effectively resolved. But the question matters more than almost any other in this series, because the answer changes everything about what the SLA really was, everything about why it did what it did, and everything about who, in the end, it actually served.
We also wish to express to the people how important it is to recognize the meaning of the enemy's strategy. We must recognize that enemy propaganda and psychological warfare will be used throughout the struggle for freedom. We must combat enemy attempts to demoralize us, for in the face of the failure to achieve military solutions against the People's Army, the enemy has to then step up its efforts in the propaganda war. Their aim is to, 1, to prevent a liberation movement from getting underway by destroying it at its source, that is, by undermining the will to fight. And 2, where revolutionary warfare has actually begun, to conquer it by political means. That is to say, by granting just sufficient political, economic, and social reform for the moment to encourage all but the so-called extremists to abandon the struggle and then kill off the leadership of the people, as in the period of King and Malcolm, and then reinstate as they did the oppression and murder of the then defenseless people.
Thank you for listening to House on Fire, Patty Hearst, the SLA, and the Seduction of Revolution. My name is H. Allegra Lansing, and this is a story about a country at war with itself, and about what happens when a generation's fury collapses into the worst possible reaction. The Symbionese Liberation Army did not fail because the injustice they saw wasn't real. They failed because they chose violence, and violence is the one form of resistance that entrenched power already knows how to defeat. It has been defeating it for centuries. Everyone swept up in the movement would pay a cost beyond measure, even an heiress to the nation's most powerful media empire. In our next episode of House on Fire, Cinque escapes from prison. What he finds on the outside is a world that is already organized, already radicalized, already waiting for exactly the symbol he has decided to become. In this episode, we meet the first people who will become the Symbionese Liberation Army, a gifted law student who rejects her education in favor of the revolution, a Vietnam veteran who signed up for a second tour of combat duty and came home knowing things he could never unknow, a gentle idealist who kept going back to Vacaville because his conscience demanded it, and a woman who got sober specifically to be useful to the cause. None of them could have built what was coming alone. This webcast is based on historical records, contemporary reporting, and archival research. All writing and most narration by yours truly. Theme music is Red Shift by The Grey Room with Density and Time. Additional audio recordings by members of the Symbionese Liberation Army.